All right, we got you for 4 hours today. Everyone awake? Okay. Quick show of hands. How many regulators are in the room? Okay. And I presume the rest of you are non-regulators. How many of you have less than a year's worth of experience with hazardous waste regs? Okay, everyone else that didn't raise your hand, out. No. Just keep in mind, this is a basics course. Even though it's 4 hours, it's 120 some odd slides. We're going to roll through it pretty quick. Some of the slides are very, very simple. Some of them have a lot of wording, and I'm not reading all that stuff. This presentation is on the CUPA Forum Board website on PDF, and my purpose for that is for you to use that as a guide. So it's got a table of contents, and you can kind of roll through it. Most of the slides have regulatory citation for reference, so that's kind of how we design this. That's us. That's a recent picture of me on the left. I don't know how recent that picture is of you, Darwin. I think that's dated. But that's our contact information.
Longer hair.
Yeah. We want to hold questions till the end because it's quite possible that some of your questions may get answered during the course of the lecture. So hopefully we'll have time. I know no one wants to be late to lunch. But if we don't get to your question, feel free to email either one of us and we'll get back to you promptly, okay? Got to have a disclaimer, right? So even though Darwin and I have vetted this whole thing several times, I had help from our Hazardous Waste Technical Advisory Group folks and DTSC, it still is possible that there's some misinformation, okay? So no one's going to be liable. Okay. Don't hold us liable. I had to put on the bottom also our Board of Supervisors aren't liable, our agency is not liable, and my new program manager is not liable, okay?
But you did put the slides together, so
yes.
He's at least culpable.
These are our areas that we're going to cover today, all right? Just a basic introduction for hazardous waste. We're going to talk about on-site storage and handling, some record keeping, manifesting. We're going to touch briefly on large quantity generators, some emergency planning requirements, some handy tips for industry to stay in compliance, and we'll talk a little bit about progressive enforcement. How many people are mainly concentrating on the hazardous waste track here? Well, there's some very, very in-depth classes. I wrote these down yesterday. There was a 4-hour class Monday dedicated to hazardous waste identification and classification. Very in-depth, intense. We're not doing that here. Tuesday, there was a 4-hour class on advanced inspector training for hazardous waste. In-depth, we're not doing that here. After this class, there's a 2-hour class dedicated to nothing but large quantity generators. Mickey Pierce is giving that. So these are very, very in-depth classes that'll take some of this material and really expand upon it. So if you can, take advantage of that. Okay, here we go. Hazardous waste. Sorry, but I got to throw in some statutory stuff at the beginning. There is a definition in the law for what waste is. I think we all kind of have an idea of what it is, but basically it's something that you're going to discard, okay? And there's your reference on the bottom there in the Health and Safety Code. Well, if you're going to discard it, there's a definition of what discarding is also, all right? So you're either going to dispose of it, burn it, incinerate it, or you're going to accumulate and store it before then. Or it's recycled in certain ways. I think there was a recycling class yesterday. How many hours was that? 2? 2 hours of recycling. Anyone go to that? Did you like that? It's a tough class. So considered inherently waste-like, or it poses a threat to human health in the environment. And this is an interesting one for inspectors. You can use this if you have mislabeled drums, even if it's material. It's got to be marked and labeled, right? Or if it's a material and it's packaged in deteriorating containers. So there's time frames on that. If they don't meet those time frames, it falls into being a discarded material. All right, so we know what a waste is. What's a hazardous waste? Okay. Hazardous waste exhibit one or more of the following properties. I'm sorry, I'm reading. It can ignite. It's flammable. It's corrosive. It can blow up. Or it's proven to be toxic to living organisms. Reference on the bottom in Title 22, Many wastes are listed either as federal or RCRA wastes or state non-RCRA wastes. And other wastes need to be tested for their characteristic. So we got basically two categories: listed wastes, characteristic wastes. So we'll talk a little bit about listed. A lot of verbiage here, okay? So I'm not going to read through it, but it's there for your reference. And the federally listed wastes are in Title 22. It's been incorporated into the regulation. And these are wastes that are considered hazardous throughout the United States. Okay, California also has their own list of chemicals that, if it exists as a waste, it's going to be a hazardous waste, period. There's a couple private companies that will talk to you for a whole week on RCRA regulations. We only have a couple minutes to do that here, so I'm just touching on it lightly, but I just want you to be aware of this mixture rule. Maybe you've heard that term, but what it means is if you have a RCRA listed waste in a mixture, then that entire mixture is going to be that RCRA waste. Okay? So we talked about listed waste real briefly. Now we need to talk about characteristic hazardous waste. And there's 4 categories for determining if a waste is characteristically hazardous: ignitability, corrosivity, reactivity, and toxicity. And for emphasis, I try to put some words in red for you. And right out of the regulation, ignitability is kind of obvious. Will it burn? But actually, there are numbers to deal with. If it has a flash point less than 140 degrees Fahrenheit, if it's readily ignitable or is an oxidizer, and there's a definition of that in 49 Code of Federal Regulations. Some examples, your ignitable solvents. There are metal dusts that meet this definition. Corrosivity, everyone familiar with the pH scale? Okay, in the middle is not 0, neutral is 7. So as you get below 7, you tend to be an acid or acidic conditions. Above 7 is basic or alkaline. But for characteristic hazardous waste for corrosivity, once you reach a pH of less than or equal to 2 or greater than or equal to 12.5, when you're on those extreme ends, your waste is going to be characteristic for corrosivity. Examples: caustic hot tank liquids, and a lot of your metal finishing process tanks. Reactivity: some wastes are very unstable, produce toxic gases when mixed with water, or we have a Toshiba service station software update. Okay. They react violently with water. They generate toxic gases when mixed with water. Cyanide, sulfur, H2S things, and the bottom one. Cyanide or sulfur-bearing wastes, which, when exposed to pH conditions between 2 and 12.5, can generate toxic gases. Is everyone familiar with how our gas chamber works? That hasn't been used in a long time? They drop cyanide pellets into acid and creates cyanide gas. Reactivity continued. They're capable of detonation or explosion if heated or placed under confinement. Readily capable of detonation, so these are your explosives. Examples are picric acid, sodium metal, and cyanide. Toxicity is the biggest characteristic category, in my opinion. The definition is simple. It has the potential inhaled or touched to harm humans or the environment. And as you see, toxicity testing can be quite complicated. And we're going to discuss this in detail because it's very often confusing. Whoops. Go. All right. A lot of information on here again as a guide for you, so I'm not going to read it verbatim. But basically, toxicity looks at whether a chemical can build up in an organism's body. So that's until it reaches a concentration where it's going to cause irreparable harm. There's testing that kind of mimics conditions in a landfill. because most of our landfills are not lined, and a lot of gobbledygooks in there, and under certain conditions you can get leachate from that would be hazardous. And there's also analysis that basically see if it kills fish under certain conditions. So I'm going to talk about D50 and acute LC50. And this is all, let me go back. The reference in the upper right. So that's where I'm at right now if you were to look it up in Title 22. So lethal dose and lethal concentration, are you familiar with those terms? LDs and LCs? Okay. LD is an oral LD. LC is a inhalation. Or is it dermal? I think it's dermal. Yeah, dermal. So toxicologists generally refer to the concentrations that kill 1/2 of the test subjects. So we don't, even though the Title 22 talks about rats and rabbits, we don't do any of those tests in Orange County. I don't know if anyone else does. But there are reference material, the Merck Index and NIOSH Registry of Toxic Effects. Those folks already have data on that. You can use those references to see if the material, go back. There are numbers in Title 22, limit numbers for that. So you can use those reference materials to see if your particular waste exceeds that threshold. But the one that we do deal with is the aquatic bioassay. The aquatic bioassay is a 96-hour test that a state-certified lab will perform. Basically, they take a certain genus and species of fish. I think rainbow trout's in there, golden shiners, and fathead minnows. Fathead minnows seem to be in the crosshairs all the time for the testing. And they see if your waste is going to be killing half of those fish at a certain concentration. Sadly enough, if it doesn't kill the fish, the lab kills the fish anyways. They don't reuse them. There are extremely hazardous wastes listed in Title 22. These are wastes with very low lethal doses. Examples of that include arsenic, cyanide, and beryllium. We'll just make sure. We're going to take breaks on the hour pretty much. Where are we at, Darwin? 8:20, rolling right along. Very good. Bioaccumulation testing. We're going to spend some time on this. We talked about it earlier a little bit. This is when toxic materials build up in the body and they reach a certain level where it causes irreparable harm. There's basically 3 types of tests, 2 of which are in California regulation. One is a federal test that, of course, is also in California regulation. At the bottom, it talks about total threshold limit concentration, a TTLC test, and a soluble threshold limit concentration, or an STLC. These are mainly done for heavy metals. Examples include arsenic, chromium, lead, mercury, and nickel. Some of those metals are also listed federally, but TTLC and STLC testing are California tests. So the TTLC test is basically how much in milligrams per kilogram or parts per million do I have of this particular heavy metal. And this is when we have an unknown that our inspector feels that through experience or talking with their colleagues that this waste may exceed regulated heavy metals, we ask our responsible party, our generator, to take a representative sample and take it to a state-certified lab, and we have them start with a TTLC test. It's a few $100s. They run all of the 17 or so regulated heavy metals, and usually that test by itself can conclude whether or not their waste is going to be characteristic for heavy metals. But we ask them also, you may have to do further testing, and we'll get into that. So the STLC is a soluble test that of that original total amount, how much of that would be able to be leached out And it tries to mimic landfill conditions in California. So here we go. These are the steps involved. Like I said, we're going to start with a TTLC test. It's also known as a total metals test or a nitric acid test. This is a little complicated, so bear with me. If your tested concentration is equal to or greater than the accepted TTLC value, and they're listed in regulation, and it's not zero, you're allowed to have a certain amount of these regulated heavy metals. But if it's over that threshold, it's hazardous waste right there. So you know you got a hazardous waste. If the tested concentration is less than the TTLC value, but greater than the STLC value, then in this example, we're going to proceed further to step 3. If the tested concentration is less than both TTLC and STLC, for heavy metals anyways, it's considered non-hazardous. Follow? Is that so far so good? Okay. So here's step 3. Everyone knows their basic math, right? You take that STLC value and you factor it, multiply it by 10. If the tested concentration from the TTLC test is less than 10 times the STLC, the waste is assumed to be non-hazardous. Now this value of 10 is because during the STLC test, they do a 1 to 10 dilution. Okay? And we're just talking math here. We're trying to determine, do I need my generator to spend the extra money to do an STLC test? These STLC tests are metal specific and they can get pricey. If the tested concentration is more than 10 times the STLC, it's quite possible it's going to be hazardous. And then you can ask your generator to have the state lab go ahead and run for that whatever particular metal. We always ask for these test results to be provided to the CUPA, and then because oftentimes the generators really don't know what's going on with how this stuff works. Okay, so if we're going to opt for that STLC test, we're going to do what's called a waste extraction test, and STLC is soluble metals or a citric acid test. So here we go again. If that tested concentration from the wet test is equal to or greater than the accepted STLC value, it's going to be hazardous again, just kind of like with the TTLC. If it's less, then it's going to be considered non-hazardous for that particular regulated metal. Okay? Here's just a quick example. So for nickel, the TTLC regulatory limit is 2,000 milligrams per kilogram or parts per million. The STLC value is 20. So our lab results were 300. So following this rationale, do I have a, oh, look at that. If you take your STLC and multiply it by 10, it's 200. So theoretically, it's possible that this, even though this is less than 2,000, theoretically it could have enough soluble metal to exceed the STLC, and we would ask for the generator to have the lab run an STLC nickel. Does that make sense? Okay. There's the third test. This is what's out of 40 CFR in RCRA, but we have it also in Title 22. It's a TCLP, or a toxic characteristic leaching procedure. This has 6 or 7, 8 metals and several solvents. But specifically for metals, you're going to want to, this one has a 1 to 20 dilution. So you look at that value off the TTLC and you do a mathematical factor of 20, because if it's going to exceed the threshold on TCLP, not only do you have a hazardous waste, but you have a RCRA hazardous waste. And I'm going to pass the baton.
All right, folks. Just a brief introduction. My name is Darwin Chang, and I'm a program supervisor, just like Terry is at Orange County Environmental Health. And I'm also in charge of our emergency response team. And Terry and he's have had a lot more experience than I have. I've only had about 18 years of experience, most of which was with the fire department in Anaheim, and then went to Orange County Environmental Health to run their emergency response team. So I have done a lot of inspections, and I'm going to kind of talk to you guys about, I know many of you are new to the inspection world as hazardous waste inspectors, or you had less than 2 years on the job. I want to explain to you some of the type of generators, businesses that we serve, and I emphasize serve, because they are our business clients, and it's important for us to treat them with respect. On the other hand, when they violate the rules in the Health and Safety Code in Title 22, I don't know if many of you guys know, but the hazardous waste laws is one of the few environmental laws that have criminal penalties. And so we have to strike that balance between treating our business clients with respect, but also being honest with them about what they're doing is actually potentially a felony. And so we're going to go through some of our businesses. You're going to see some of the places that you'll inspect, some of the type of waste streams that you can expect to see. So retail markets, big box stores, where you might get groceries, where you might do your daily shopping. They might have broken bottles that they have to take care of, or maybe your local hardware store where they collect paint, or maybe perhaps you have a local place where you take old films and develop them, and they might have a photo fix. Furniture, wood finishing places, very highly customized. They're very proud of their business because it's an art for some of them to build custom furniture or to be able to stain them in a certain way. I remember when my wife was making our baby crib for our little baby several years back, we went to this very specific local hardware store, and I went there and I said, yeah, that brown. No, that's not brown, sir. That is a specific cherry wood red. Okay. So they are very proud of their work, and they use a lot of solvents. They use a lot of paint stain remover, maybe even some paint stripper that are toxic. And so you need to be walking through those places, looking for those things, asking those questions of how do they do this process, and how is that being generated, and how is it being stored. Printing industry. I just went through an inspection earlier last week, and it's corrugated boxes, and they make these basically cardboard boxes for the movie industry to put up their posters and stuff. And they still use basically a negative to do their negative filming and then print out the actual print. And they also have direct print, just using basic inkjet printer, a gigantic one. I think they said it was like $30,000 or something like that. It's a very expensive printer. But they also use solvents. They have to clean printing industries. They have the rollers. They have to clean the rollers, and they're using some of the solvents to get the ink off, scraping it off, putting into a drum, and labeling as hazardous waste. Okay, this is probably the majority of the places now in California that we are responsible for inspecting. And basically your local auto repair shops, dealerships that do repairs, and local gas stations that might have a garage on the side besides pumping gas. you have all of this stuff that you would have to look at, and many times they're stored way in the back in a corner, packed up with tires or packed up with old rags. Those are the things that you have to really go in and ask the business owner to remove some of this stuff, because we're going to talk about some violations later on down the slides about how they need to be storing this stuff. Pesticides application services. So Northern California, Central California, we have a lot of farming industries and places that service the farming industries. They're going to have some of this materials and waste that they would have to get rid of if they are outdated, or if they are just simply down to the last few drops and they have to get rid of it because it's very extremely hazardous. And machine shops, and these are your places that are making parts, making widgets, like so we call making widgets. They might be making screws, nuts, bolts, all the way down to as simple as I've inspected a place that made the ball to the ball pen. And it was so interesting to watch literally thousands of feet of stainless steel, basically rods and strings, and they cut it up and they polish it up and they mill it and they turn it into little balls that inserts into the ball pen. And then all the way as big as airplane parts. Your contractors that do military work, or you're making airplane parts to go onto an airplane. Don't forget our schools. Our schools and our local unified school districts, they're in charge of several schools in their districts. They are basically generators of waste because they do have an auto shop. How many of you guys took auto shop and auto body in high school? I loved that class. If I didn't do this, I would be a Porsche mechanic. That's what I would do. I loved it. Mechanic shops. A lot of mechanic shops teachers, they teach kids how to do Bondo over the paint, the body, change oil. I remember building my first little engine using a lawnmower engine and making it run. And then also the chemistry teacher. The chemistry teacher making science work for kids. Well, they actually generate waste. They have to store waste, and also, most importantly, sometimes they keep the old stuff around for years and years and years, and somehow they retire, and the next teacher comes in and they don't know what it is, and it's crystallizing around the bottle. Our emergency response team have had to respond to some of those schools, and it turns out to be picric acid, or some kind of an acid that has dehydrated and has crystals around it. And then, of course, you have the print shop at your schools. Back in the day, they were still using PhotoFix to do the negative photography class. They still do that. Okay, this is building maintenance, and I would just kind of lump that with some of your bigger industries. If you walk into a place that has a contract with the military, multiple buildings on a campus, they'll have a building maintenance section that are in charge specifically to take care of that business. Or you might actually have a cleaning service business that goes into various offices and pick up stuff. And unfortunately, sometimes they pick up hazardous waste because the business owner have left something that should not have gone to the trash, and now the business vendors that service that building picks it up and they don't know what to do with it. Okay, this is your bulk, and we lumped metal finishing and printed circuit boards. They're two separate industries, to be quite honest, for those of you that are new. But but we kind of lump them in one slide because we're basically talking about what Terry earlier mentioned about the testing of toxic metals. They produce, manufacture things using metals, and through their processes, through their dip tanks, through their printed circuit board tanks, making circuit boards, the process generate heavy metals. That includes cyanide, that may include any spent plating waste, and there are other classes in this CUPA conference that talks about treatment of that waste. Now, for some of the businesses, they might not do treatment, and they might simply haul off that waste as hazardous waste in bulk containers. Laboratories. Research laboratories that do R&D. A very huge business in Southern California and in California in general is vitamin supplement places. They have a lot of R&D and research laboratories that are using the chemicals to make or to test the vitamins and the supplements, and these are the type of waste that you might run into during their testing, and they might not know exactly how to manage it because they're in the business of making vitamins, making people healthy, not really thinking about, oh wow, we generate any waste. And chemical manufacturers. Chemical manufacturers, many times there's some chlorinated solvents, some kind of a solvent that they're making. Ultimately, their bulk material, raw material, turns into something else. We have had businesses we had to respond to where their chemical A and chemical B mixed together, and it did a runaway reaction, and it wouldn't stop because one of those raw materials was contaminated with something, or maybe perhaps it was stored at a temperature, and it started to self-react. And so these chemical manufacturing places, they usually have a pretty good representative as your environmental contact that can help you and guide you, walk you through that process of how they make certain chemicals, and along with that, generating any type of hazardous waste. Okay, along with auto repair shops, these are your mom and pop dry cleaners. There's multiple dry cleaners of various sizes with various type of business owners that would own this. Through the Air Quality Management Board and the air quality rules, a lot of the PERC has been eliminated because they have a sunset time for their machine or limiting their amount of PERC they use. And so what you might be seeing is your solid solvent, your things that are not, they're not PERC, and they are basically the hydrocarbon cleaners that cleans your clothes. And of course, don't forget the filters. Many times the business owners don't see that as hazardous waste. They just see, oh, it's lint from clothing. And we've actually have had several enforcement cases against local businesses that threw their filters into the trash. Because, yeah, you know, at home you have your little lint cleaner, and what do you do with that? You throw it into the trash. And they kind of have that same mentality because they're not really sure. They know that the PERC or the solvent they have to take care of because it really, you know, that stuff they can't really dump it into their sewer, but they're gonna take their filters, toss it, or scrape off whatever sludge that's off of that, and they might dump it in the trash. You might have to inspect that. Okay, again, paint shops, similar to auto repair. Paint shops, you'll have a lot of the paint paint thinners, sludge, sanding, grinding dust. And I would just say one thing, that we have found many places, even though they're using the Bondo and the Bondo doesn't seem very harmful, you look on the MSDS, there's really not a whole lot of hazardous components, but what they're sanding off on an old car, that paint that comes off along with that process, we have proven in our jurisdiction that that is hazardous. And so there are places that specifically do, they don't do any paint. We've been to, Terry and I have been to places that specializes, and this guy only does, if you bring in a custom car, there's no paint on it, it's just like straight aluminum body, and they'll do little fixes in there, here and there. That might not be hazardous, but if you're going to your general automotive repair paint shops and where they're sanding off the paint, fixing the paint filters, as well as the paint dust, that's going to be hazardous. Okay, we're kind of switching a little bit of topic. We're talking about universal waste. Universal waste is relatively new, and basically it's DTSC adopted new regulations for universal waste because we just simply have a lot of them. Okay, every business office got batteries, got lights, fluorescent lights. We have thermometers, thermostats for places, and so we've adopted. DTSA has adopted these rules, specifically calling them universal waste. So what they include, again, fluorescent light tubes that contain mercury, thermostats. We've done a lot of remodel in, we have responded to a lot of places where they did apartments remodel. We would respond to a local apartment place where they're doing asbestos and removal, and then lo and behold, there's a thermostats, whole bunch of them, all 50 of them in a trash bin. And so those things are hazardous because it has the mercury bulb in there. Electronics, self-explanatory. Printed circuit boards have to be regulated. Their products are universal waste because it cannot go into the trash because of the circuit boards. Batteries. You guys, your local office, I'm going to assume in today's world, every office has that little area where your employer tells you where to put your batteries, right? Into a little bag and then put it into a little 5-gallon bucket so that they can take care of it as part of universal waste. More switches, basically mercury. Thermometers we've had to respond to, and also just regular services. As new inspectors, you're expected to answer calls from your business clients. Some of your business clients might be a dental office or a medical office. We have blood pressure cuffs that needs to be taken care of because it has a lot of mercury in it. Can I just throw that into the trash? The answer is no. Non-empty aerosol cans. So we're going to talk about what's empty and what's not empty. But aerosol cans, if they're not empty, we have to find a way to empty them, collect that waste, and you do have a lot of that industries, regardless of what business we have, whether it is a high-tech industry or even a job shop, everyone has aerosol cans. Okay, here are the steps. Okay, so if you're not familiar with universal waste and how to manage them, we're laying it out step by step what it is. Okay, There are only three ways to transport universal waste: a hazardous waste recycling facility, a consolidation location if the business has multiple sites and wishes to store all of their universal waste in one location, a hazardous waste land disposal facility for those universal waste where there's no recycling requirement. Additional steps. Okay, again, universal waste cannot go to the regular trash. If you got light bulbs that are broken or fluorescent tubes that are broken and you throw it into the trash, the general rule is you're not treating it according to these management steps. That now becomes hazardous waste. No different than that school or the apartment complex that threw all the thermostats into the trash. If you're not handling that universal waste according to these rules, you've just turned that universal waste back to hazardous waste. And so all those rules about felonies and hazardous waste dumping, that now applies. You do not need to have a hazardous waste identification number, and that you may not store universal waste more than 12 months, and the universal waste must be labeled. Okay, this is what I was talking about. Breakage, leakage, you got to package them properly and store it as universal waste. If you can't, we've had to respond or actually investigate places that had leaking batteries, that sulfuric acid that comes out. If you're not cleaning that up properly and calling that hazardous waste, or if you're able to clean it up and repackage that battery, and you can continue to say that that is universal waste. But if you decide to sweep up that sulfuric acid with absorbents and that absorbents goes into the trash, now we're back to hazardous waste. Okay, train your employees in managing universal waste, such as handling, packaging, storage, labeling, and emergency response. Utilize appropriate shipping papers such as bill of lading. Manifest not required. Keep all hazardous waste receipts stored for at least 3 years for inspections. Here is what we talked about earlier about aerosol cans and how you need to notify the CUPA if you're actually going to be puncturing, draining, crushing aerosol cans. You'll be surprised, a lot of your businesses, a lot of your business clients, they hire a contractor to come, and the contractor simply says, oh yeah, aerosol cans, no problem. Universal waste, we got it, no problem. Be sure to ask, how is your business client handling that? Are all those cans empty? How do they treat non-empty ones? What if the nozzle is broken? Okay, I can tell you with definitive fact, because we were there to do a lot of dumpster dives, investigations throughout Southern California, and one of the major investigation keys is finding aerosol cans are not empty, and it's in the regular trash. Okay, so we talked about various industries, different type of industries. Now we're going to actually go into the bulk of our hazardous waste handling. Here's the bulk of the things that you as an inspector, you need to be looking for. And if I see a lot of business clients here, these are the things that the inspector is going to be looking for, and you need to be pretty clear on at least the lingo. We're not, again, Terry said, we're not going to go into too much details on each particular topic because it does have a whole head on its own, and you have to kind of read up on some of the facts. But this is the, if you had to do a checklist, we're going to go through that right now. Okay, containers and drums and containers, they gotta be in good condition, okay, with a tight-fitting lid. We've had cardboards as a lid, no good. Cardboards over a drum, no good. I've had simply super sacks that are not tied at the top and it's just left open because, oh, we're using it. Oh, really? But it's already full. How do you use it? It's already full. It's time to close it. The material of the drums gotta be compatible with the drum itself, okay? We've had response with the fire departments and our emergency response team going out to sites where the nitric acid is eating through the poly drum. And we've actually had an off-gas situation where the bomb squad had to come and shoot a water slug into the drum, into the top area where there's no liquid, and literally all the acid spewed out of that drum onto the bomb squad's robot. That was an $80,000 spill that the company fortunately had the insurance for. But it's got to be compatible with the materials that you're going to put the drum in. Got to be kept closed when it's not used, properly labeled, handled, stored in a manner to prevent rupture and leakage, or else the local bomb squad's going to have to show up to relieve that overpressurized drum. And then, of course, you got to inspect it at least weekly. Containers labeling, we're going to talk a little bit more about it down the road here in the slides, in a few slides. But it has to be properly, if it's a hazardous waste, you have to properly label it. And it doesn't matter what kind of size of all that. If it stores hazardous waste and you as a generator or you as an inspector have found out through your interview, through your inspection, that it's hazardous waste, it has to be labeled. Okay, so on hazardous waste containers that's portable, used for storage, not for transportation, it has to be on there. That's in the regulation. There's no buts, ifs. I've had situations where, the business is like, well, yeah, that's the used solvent, or that's the used whatever. Great, you've identified the product. That's another requirement, but it actually doesn't say hazardous waste. So it has to say hazardous waste on there. I've had other situations where I've gone to larger businesses where they have a hazardous waste storage area, and it says hazardous waste storage area, and then none of the drums were labeled, okay? In my early days, when I was first inspecting, I thought, oh, that's fine, yeah, it's hazardous, common sense, right? I was wrong, okay? It has to say hazardous waste. It has to have all of this information on each of the drum. So do not be fooled by someone who might know the rules just a little bit and say, well, don't you see it's a hazardous waste storage area. All these drums, they're all hazardous waste. Don't worry about it. Can't do that. Hazardous properties, whether it's flammable, toxic, reactive, corrosive, what is the physical state? And most importantly, we're going to talk about the accumulation start date. Every drum has to have its own accumulation start date. Here it is. This is the one that you've seen, many of you have seen, or have to have if you're a business client. You have stacks of these stored in your drawers. Some of them are pre-printed by your contractors. I want to kind of talk about that. Many of our businesses in Orange County have very good contractors, and you as your environmental contact, you rely on your contractors to do their job. Well, guess what? They're not doing their job, and they're mislabeling stuff. They're not checking off any of this information. They might have their Hazardous Waste codes and EPA codes and EPID number printed on there because that they need for transportation. They're covering their butts. Sorry, they're not covering your butts. So you, as the generator of the waste, is fully responsible for getting this information correct and all of this stuff correct. We have found many times where this area is completely blank, no start date, and I talk to the environmental contacts, oh no, you know, so-and-so company X and family guy, he's a totally good guy and he comes and gives me a discount. He takes care of my labeling. Sorry, that's your responsibility to do that, and the inspector is going to write it up as a violation. Empty containers. Okay, there's a whole thing about empty containers, but I'm just going to go very quickly. The key thing to this about empty container, what is empty is no longer pourable, or if the content have been scraped out as much as reasonably possible. Extremely vague, okay? This is where, you know, the industry and the regulation and the regulators might have a little bit differences of opinion. But it's gonna, if I were inspecting you guys, I'm gonna ask, what is your procedure to call this drum empty? Okay? If you're telling me, oh, all I do is I look at it, nothing comes out, it's good, okay? But if I see there's kicked on stuff and it's scrapable, it's not empty. You gotta inspect it and you gotta do this procedure. So make sure your staff is doing that, inspecting that. 5-gallon containers or less, okay? Basically the same rule applies. It has to be empty. We have done many dumpster dives at furniture places, paint shops, printing shops, where they're ink sludge or any type of solvent-based type of unreacted materials, resins, things like that that have gone in because they have little quart-size containers, and they're closed. And it's heavy, okay? Some of the paint industries I've done one where it was t-shirt printing, silk screens, okay? They have 5-gallon little ink, and it's heavy. And so, oh no, it's totally dry. Oh, you don't need to look at it. I'll go in, I'll look at it, and I'll take a little stick, and it's completely gooey beneath the top surface, okay? That is pourable. That becomes a hazardous waste violation. And in fact, if it's found in the dumpster, that is now possibly a felony. Empty containers, liners, removed from containers greater than 5 gallons, okay? Same rule applies. You gotta have a bill of lading, drum recycler or reconditioner, and basically it can't go into the trash. Your 5-gallon or maybe your quart size, once it's empty, it can go into trash. If it's 55 gallons or basically over 5 gallons, can't go into the trash. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. It's not exactly hazardous waste rules, but it's really your local municipal companies that take this trash, and the landfill people, they don't want your 55-gallon drums. It's in regulation, okay. Tanks, tank systems. Certain hazardous waste treatment tanks and holding tanks. We're talking about possibly big, medium-sized to big businesses that treat their hazardous waste. They have to, or they have a big Baker tank that's bolted down to the floor. Any tank systems, it may require a professional engineer to sign off on it, and there's a whole slew of requirements under this section. Tank labeling, again, gotta have a hazardous waste, the word hazardous waste on there, and accumulation start date clearly marked on the tank. Storage time, we're gonna talk about some accumulation times. That really depends on what type of generator you are, and we're gonna talk about some of that. And also satellite storage accumulation. Okay, so I know I don't have a picture here, you guys kind of have to use your imagination. Conditionally exempt small quantity generators. Businesses that generate less than or equal to 100 kilograms or 220 pounds or approximately 27 gallons of hazardous waste per month, they have 180 days. We're talking about your bicycle, your lawnmower, small places, or maybe a specialty shop where they only do degreasing of certain electronic parts, or basically extremely small businesses that may have only 1 or 2 waste streams that you might have to inspect. And if the waste must be transported over 200 miles or more, the generators have up to 270 days. That's the definition of a CESQG. Okay, this is probably, at least in Orange County, 80% of our business clients, they're in this category. And they basically generate anywhere between 27 gallons and 275 gallons, or if you're talking about solids, 220 pounds to 2,200 pounds of hazardous waste per month. And the same rule applies, approximately 6 months, or the 270 days rules applies. Okay, now we're talking about large quantity generator. There's a whole section of law and regulations that's dedicated to large quantity. And these are places that are your big manufacturers, your military contractors, possibly your big box stores, depending on what kind of waste that they're reporting to you and what you see. These are the places that generate waste. There's approximately 275 gallons per month. They only have up to 90 days. Okay, so satellite accumulation. You know, when I first started in this business 17 years ago, satellite accumulation. Like, is there like a satellite like in space monitoring this stuff? I had no idea what they were talking about. Satellite accumulation allows storage of small amounts of hazardous waste up to 1 year. Basically, what they're saying is, in any size of business, you can have multiple areas where you can store hazardous waste, and there is a specific rule about storing that waste, because if you're a large quantity generator, okay, you have a big campus, multiple buildings, multiple rooms, research lab, maintenance storage area, shop. And then you have your 90-day storage area, okay? It's very unreasonable to keep on traveling from various locations to that 90-day storage area. And so we have this rule for satellite accumulation so that you can store a single type of hazardous waste up to a year, and here is what you need to do, okay? So I have this area that I work in, and here's my drum. And the example that I can think of is when I went to a place where they were doing painting. So this is the paint booth, and they're spraying the paint, but they have to clean their spray gun, okay? Well, the spray gun cleaning stuff, it's all right here in a 55-gallon drum, okay? I'm painting and I gotta switch paint. I'm switching out stuff, okay? The waste stored at the initial point of generation and under the control of the operator of the process generating the waste. I've had situation and the business client argued, I am doing my work over here and my drum is over there, but I have to get through a door and then walk through a different department and say hello to my friends, have some coffee, and get to my drum. And that drum is in a completely different section under complete different management of people. I've said, no, that's not good enough. It's not meeting this requirement. Because if that spilled or someone else doesn't know about it, you don't have control over it. We'll hold off on those questions. So that's kind of debatable, okay? But I'm calling out something that's depends on the situation and depends on how your business is run. And as an inspector, I have to ask, how are you handling your waste? How is this item that you're generating waste gets to this area? Maximum of 55 gallons of hazardous waste or 1 quart of extremely hazardous waste is accumulated at any one satellite location. The containers and drums are properly labeled. Within 3 days after reaching the maximum storage quantity, a new accumulation date, the date that limits was reached, must be marked on the container and the waste removed off-site within a specific time limit, 90 days or 180 days, depending on what kind of total generation of waste you fall under. I've personally never used this type of labeling, but it's good, it works.
All right. I'm going to go back. Lion Technology gave training earlier this week, and I talked to Reagan. Is Reagan still here? She spent 2 hours on satellite accumulation, okay? This is basic. There are a lot of nuances about it, and it is oftentimes very confusing. So I would recommend if you are in a facility that the operator's claiming, oh, that's a satellite drum, start asking questions using this basic information. The first one up here, what Darwin said is generally correct. However, if that drum is not feasibly able to be right next to where it's being generated, and it's not in direct sight of the operator, it needs to be locked up. So that's just to prevent somebody coming, oh, it's a waste drum, and he's throwing some incompatible stuff in there. So there are some nuances with this, just to understand. And one thing that the slide is not mentioning is you have 1 year to collect within this drum, okay? So I'm sorry, let me back up. If you have, you have 1 year to collect the 55 gallons. If you are reaching, back up. Forget what I said. See, 2 hours, right, Reagan? 2 hours. So this is just basic concepts, okay? It's really not intended to be confusing. So it's there within the accumulation part of the regulations. It's really difficult to read through the regs, and we just wanted to put bullet point items up here for you. And the labeling that's just an example. Basically what I liked about it is it had, where's it at? Initial start date and then the date when it got full. So you as an inspector knew, because you have to have the initial start date on it and then when it got full also. Okay, hazardous waste transportation, disposal, and record keeping. This is the regulatory section where the business is required to have, if you're a generator, you're required to have an identification number. The identification number is when you ship hazardous waste off-site. And based on the type of hazardous waste generator you are, you either need a federal or an EPA number. So here are the requirements to determine what kind of ID number you need. If you're a generator that generates more than 1 kilogram of RCRA acutely hazardous waste per month, or more than 100 kilograms, or 27 gallons, of RCRA waste per month, you're going to need a federal number. If you generate RCRA hazardous waste in amounts below the federal EPA ID number, or you generate non-RCRA hazardous waste, or California only, then you need just the California ID number. A little bit about hauling of waste. When we do our inspections in Orange County, our inspections are unannounced, but every so often the timing is just right, and we are there when the hauler is on site. And I always take advantage of that to kind of sit and watch how they're doing things, how they're packaging the waste. Even though we had the example of the hazardous waste label earlier, that actual label is not required for on-site storage. We just want the information. So sometimes they've got their rules of labels because that label is required for off-site transportation. So I like to sit and watch how they're doing the labeling. Maybe take some photos for future training in-house. So if you're ever on site doing an inspection and the hauler is on site, get a drink of water and kick back and watch things. You'll learn a lot. So for hauling waste, we're going to talk about the Uniform Hazardous Waste Manifest briefly, the Consolidated Manifest, some self-hauling regulations, and the bill of lading. The Uniform Hazardous Waste Manifest, you can read that, all right? There's a lot of information on these things, and I found that I recently have been assigned 5 brand new staff, first time in years that we've had that many new staff, and we're bringing them up to speed gently. And this is one area that we want to make sure that our inspectors are pretty familiar with, and that's reviewing these manifests. A lot of times, all we're looking at on these things are the dates and the volumes, and does this make sense insofar as what's being hauled off site? But there's a lot of other things on here that I would advise you as an inspector to become more familiar with. And all I did on this is I took sections of this to make it a little bit bigger. I want to ensure that this generator ID number is correct. Typos are in there, or it's illegible. So this is oftentimes either pre-printed, which is great, or it's handwritten. Here's going to be your generator's name and mailing address. This is going to be your transporter, whoever that hauler is that you might have the opportunity to watch. They're going to put in their number. There's a class here for dealing with what's known as a hazardous waste tracking system. It's a state website that requires a username and password to get into it. Oops, sorry. And you can verify all this information. And a lot of these manifests, most of them, hopefully all of them, end up being uploaded onto that website. But there is a lag time. Diana's here. Diana, is about 4 months? 4 to 6 months lag time, just be aware. But before you're going out to your larger sites, you can do a little background search on them and check for this stuff. Wherever this waste is going to end up, the grave, so to speak, is the designated facility address, name and address. And then your line items on what type of waste you have. Especially for RCRA waste, stuff has to be worded a certain way, and then they're going to have a waste number over here. Additional descriptions, again, especially for RCRA waste, they're limited on how they identify it initially. It's a US DOT description, proper shipping name, hazard class, and ID number. But what's nice is down in here, you can do basically whatever you want to call it more specifically for clarification. This is an important area that your generators really often don't realize how important it is. They're basically certifying that the waste that's on the manifest and how this thing has been filled out is correct. So whoever's printing and typing their name and signing it, they better be sure that they're aware of the responsibilities on that. So they'll do that they'll print and sign and date on the date of the shipment. The transporter will do the same. And this is a multi-page form. Copies will be given to the generator, and the rest of the copies will go with the transporter, because when they get to the final grave, there'll be another signature on the bottom, dated, and then copies of that, basically chain of custody, right? Copies of this will get sent back to the generator, so they can match up his initial pickup manifest with the destination manifest. The destination manifest is the one of most importance for you as an inspector. If all they have is the initial pickup manifest, how do you know that it got to where it's supposed to be, right? So if they don't have this final manifest on site, you should be writing violations for that. Consolidated manifest, very common. Darwin was saying earlier that we have a lot of vehicle maintenance facilities in California. Years ago, we had, and Shaw, you may know this, we had a gentleman come in to do pool training from the state of Georgia, and at the time he said there were more cars in Orange County than the entire state of Georgia. I don't know if that's still true. This has been several years ago. She remembers that. So we have a lot of waste streams that, if consolidated manifesting wasn't in regulation, that you would be seeing all these uniform manifests for everything. So the state recognized the importance of making things legitimate for tracking, yet easier for folks. So they created a consolidated manifest system. And what it is, there's no standard form. The Uniform Hazardous Waste manifest system, it's a standardized form. Everyone everyone has to use that form. Consolidated manifest can come in all types of sizes, colors, formatting. Basically, it can double as a receipt for the company. You'll see pricing on them often. But there are required items to be on a consolidated manifest. Generator's name, address, and EPA ID number, same like on the uniform, except it may be in a different spot on the paper. The name, signature, and telephone number of the generator's contact person. Again, the transporter's name, address, and EPA ID number. Usually that's pre-printed at the top, just like on a regular receipt. They need the proper shipping name of the waste. Waste antifreeze, used oil, something like that. The quantity, of course, and the date that it was taken by the transporter. See a lot of similarities with the uniform system. And name, address, and ID number of the receiving facility. Oftentimes it may be the transporter also. They may be both the transporter and the ultimate TSDF is what we call it. And there will be a manifest number on that consolidated form. An example of where you would see this is with used oil, they don't pick up the drums of used oil. They have tanker trucks that come out and they actually put a stinger and suck out the oil into the tanker. And the manifest number is going to be the same at every location they go to until their truck is full. So there won't be copies of these on the hazardous waste tracking system, just so you know. And are they working on something like that, Diane? Okay. Do we have a microphone? Is it back there? We're fortunate to have Diana Peebler from DTSC in here. She is a ringer. Sorry, that's my best description of you. She's oftentimes my go-to person on things. I just want her to briefly explain how consolidated manifesting is going to be tracked, so to speak.
You can ask DTSC for what's called a TQM, or a Transported Quarterly TQR, quarterly report. And we can pull the data from our tracking system and connect the manifest with the receipts.
Okay.
So any CUPA can come to us and ask us for that.
Okay, great. There you go. Thank you. Here's an example of the types of wastes commonly that you would run into out there in the field that use a consolidated manifesting procedure. Like I said, automotive parts cleaning solvents, used oil, spent photographic solutions, antifreeze. You can see how a lot of these are with the automotive industry. Sludge containing sodium hydroxide and heavy metals. Holy cow, really? Didn't we just talk about, pH and regulated heavy metals? I don't know if this is being used a whole lot anymore, but back in the day, every automotive place that rebuilt engines had these huge giant dip tanks and that had caustic solutions and stuff. It got put on the list. Most of the time, my experience was that this stuff did go off on a uniform manifest, but it is allowable to go off and consolidated. Dry cleaning solvent, asbestos, inks from the printing industry, and chemicals and lab packs collected from school districts. So these are allowed to go on consolidated manifests, but a lot of these ones down below you'll see on uniform manifests. Just a little snippet on self-hauling. Generators are allowed to self-haul their waste, believe it or not, without having to be a registered hazardous waste transporter, but there are limitations. I don't see it very often that they do it, but they can transport up to 5 gallons or 50 pounds of hazardous waste directly to a TSDF. I think the self-policing in this is the TSDF doesn't want it from them. They'd rather see that manifest and everything. But the container has to be properly sealed, labeled, and taken directly to the TSDF for disposal. So I just wanted you to be aware that regulations do allow for it. Whoops, there was a little thing on the bottom. And that's why it's recommended that you get approval from that TSDF before you haul that stuff on the highways. More for self-hauling. This is probably more common where they deal with waste oil. You got, what's interesting in California, there's no minimum threshold for determining if you're a generator of hazardous waste. So we got all sorts of really small generators. And sometimes, and a lot of oil is generated, waste oil is generated in the States. So sometimes the regulations can be a little tight and maybe what the generator may consider overbearing on them. I do see people self-hauling small oil without a manifest if, again, this is in regulation, each container's content does not exceed 5 gallons, the total load does not exceed 20 gallons. The person who transported the used oil was the generator, and the used oil is taken to a facility which agrees to and can accept the used oil. Let's go back. So as an inspector, when you're doing your inspection and you ask to see records for disposal of these small volumes of waste oil, and they say, oh, I just take it, go ahead. Okay. I just take it from Orange County to a buddy who's got a bigger shop in LA County, completely in a whole other CUPA jurisdiction. How would you might tie the ends on this? Well, I would ask questions, specifically where is this location at in LA County, name, address, phone number, and you just make a call. Sure, yeah, my buddy, he brings it up here once a month. It's a couple gallons. I might even call my LA CUPA jurisdiction to verify on the other end. So it's a good way to, and you should, tie up those loose ends. We talked about manifesting, uniform manifesting, consolidated manifesting, and you may have heard this word, bill of lading. What's a bill of lading? Bill of lading is just shipping paper, so it's to take into account anything that you're shipping on your truck. There's other jurisdictions, Department of Transportation in California, California Highway Patrol, that require this also. But it's going to have simple information on it so far as the date, name of the transporter, name and quantity of the material, and the destination of the material. I still have my list of the classes here. There is a recycling class. How long was that, 2 hours? Recyclable materials may be shipped using a bill of lading. I hope they talked about that in that 2-hour session. Common items C on a bill of lading are used oil and fuel filters. So when someone's having your oil changed on your car, that filter, it has its own management standards. And if you follow the management standards, you do not have to have those filters hauled off using a manifest. Batteries, automotive lead-acid batteries typically go off. They have their own management standards also. And if you're following the management standards in the law, you can use a bill of lading instead of a manifest. And universal waste that Darwin talked about earlier. Darwin spent minutes on universal waste. A 2-hour class on universal waste. How are we doing on time? Okay, about 5 more minutes, we'll take it. Record keeping requirements. All manifests, shipping papers, and or receipts, laboratory analysis that I briefly went over first part, and determinations. My batteries, good. Must be available for review. Must be available for review for a minimum of 3 years. So there's some operative words there. Must be available for review as an inspector. Sometimes people interpret that to mean they have to be on site. Well, they don't have to be on site. But while you're there doing your inspection, they must be made available for you to review. So they may be in a neighboring building somewhere or whatever. But during the course of my inspection, they have to get those documents must be available for me to review. At the end, there's a violation section that Mark Darwin's going to talk about some of these common violations. There's a lot of stuff there in the second paragraph, but basically if you're shipping RCRA hazardous waste in the United States, you're required to summarize all of your manifesting activity. And it's just there again, a lot of the stuff in this presentation is a guide for you.